Hello, good morning. I'm Margaret Malloy. I'm the Global Chief Marketing Officer at strategic branding firm Siegel+Gale. And we're delighted to have you join our webinar to discuss the value of consumer relevance to B2B brands. I am joined by my colleague Brian Rafferty, whom I will introduce in a few moments. Brian is our Head of Research and Insights at Siegel+Gale. Who are we? Siegel+Gale is a brand strategy firm, and it is our focus on simplicity that sets us apart. Specifically, we define, design, and deliver compelling brand experiences that are both unexpectedly fresh and remarkably clear. And that's the promise we make to our clients. We offer various brand strategy services ranging from research to visual identity to environments and digital implementation, all with that underpinning of simplicity. Today we are here to talk about the B2BNow study, and it is, as I mentioned, a study on the value of consumer relevance to B2B brands. During this webinar, we will speak about why we conducted the study. We will share our key findings. We will explain how we evaluated B2B brands. We will provide some practical examples of how B2B brands build consumer relevance. And finally, we will leave you with some perspective on assessing how relevant your brand is to everyday consumers. I'd like to pause a moment and share why we conducted this B2BNow study. Simply put, we are deeply interested in B2B branding and set out to understand the value of consumer relevance to B2B brands. As a preface to the study, like most of us, we set out and did some Googling, and we Googled terms like B2B versus B2C. And perhaps not surprisingly, we learned that this is a very hot topic. In fact, when you've Googled B2B versus B2C, you will return more than 1 million entries. The point here is that this is an important conversation. The evolution of B2B branding is informing much of the strategy of our clients as B2B companies and their peer companies in the industry. Yet, in our conversations and in the blogosphere, we are aware that many B2B companies still debate the business benefit of building a strong brand, that is, a brand that everyday consumers can understand and relate to. This study, the B2BNow study, sheds definitive light on the value of building B2B brand experiences that engage and are relevant to everyday consumers. I will now hand over to our Head of Research and Insights, Brian Rafferty, and remind you to please feel free to submit your questions on the stream here as well as on Twitter using hashtag B2BNow. Good morning, Brian.
Thanks, Margaret. And yes, as Margaret said, obviously I'm going to tell you about the study and some of the key takeaways and insights we've gotten from it. But it would be great for this to be a discussion, so please do share your questions, and we've given ample enough time, hopefully, to have a good discussion after I've shared some of these initial insights. So there were really 4 key takeaways we've gotten from the study in terms of what it meant for B2B brands and how they could be more relevant to consumers. As you'll see, we'll go into what the benefits of doing this are. But the 4 key takeaways was really one, that the brands that do it well make their impact tangible to consumers. They make themselves easily understandable in terms of what they do, why they do it, and what the impact is to the broader world as opposed to just potentially their core clientele. 2, many of them actually also factor consumers into how they look at innovation, and we have some interesting case studies there looking at some of the brands that have done that well. 3, they don't just think of their audience as separate, if you will, and siloed. They actually look at things cohesively and generate demand through cohesive brand experiences, whether they're providing them to a B2B audience or to consumers, and they don't differentiate that much, if you will, or in the sense they ensure that there is consistency across those audiences so that there can be a much more porous nature to the business, so that consumers potentially can then generate demand in their business lives, for example. And then the last one is that they actually use design as a way to clarify their offerings and to present what they do in ways that are most simple and understandable to people. So what was this study and how do we go about it? It was 9,500 consumers that were surveyed, 450 business decision makers, because part of what we wanted to do is look at how do consumers respond to these brands versus how do business decision makers respond to these brands. It was global, it was across 9 countries, and we looked at 64 of the top B2B focused brands. We got them from the global Fortune 100 and looked at how much money they were generating through B2B sources, and that's what led to us selecting them. And then we really looked at 2 key dimensions: familiarity, how familiar were consumers with these brands, and then connectedness, how well did they do on a series of attributes that we asked regarding to how connected consumers, as well as when we asked the business decision makers, felt around these brands. So the first thing we did was actually ask people about the brand that they felt most connected to, irrespective of whether it was B2B or B2C, and have them rate this brand on a series of attributes. And that led us to see, well, what are the attributes that actually relate most to people connecting with any type of brand? And they are the ones you see here. There were sort of 3 key themes and 5 attributes, but it was really about brands that knew them, understood their needs, brands that they saw were there for them, that were reliable, trustworthy, made their lives easier, and finally brands that communicated clearly and really told them things in ways that they could understand. So what we looked at is the brands that actually connect best with consumers. If we then look at how B2B decision makers respond to them, they were also 10% more likely to be considered by these business decision makers in doing business with them. So there was a real sort of, if you will, consideration bump that we saw for the brands that connected best to consumers. So that is one value, obviously, that you can see from connecting with consumers is those brands that connect with consumers also then are much more likely to be on the short list with their core audience, the business decision maker. The next one is we looked at, well, what are are there any differences in the business performance between the brands that do really well and the brands that didn't do so well in terms of connecting with consumers? And what we saw is that the brands that did well versus the ones that didn't had much stronger stock growth in the last 3 years, 27% higher. They had a higher ratio of intangible assets, meaning obviously goodwill, but also intellectual IP. And finally, they also had much larger growth in revenue over the last 3 years. Now, we're not saying that this means that connecting with consumers automatically makes your stock price go up or automatically adds a huge amount of revenue to your bottom line. But what we are saying is if you look at the ones that do it well versus the ones that don't, there is a definite difference in their business performance. So how did these B2B brands stack up that we put in there? Well, here are the top 10 in terms of high relevancy. As you see, they are brands that are both known to consumers, but also are ones that actually consumers felt very connected to, meaning rated them very highly on those dimensions we looked at earlier. Google being the first one, and we'll look a little bit about what Google does really well in terms of doing that. Then there were others that connected well, meaning they got rated highly by the consumers that were familiar with them, but there weren't that many who really felt all that familiar with them. And again, when we were asking consumers about these brands, we were asking them about what these brands offered in the business space to businesses. So, you see pharmaceutical brands here like Pfizer and Novartis, Roche, as well as others, financial services like Crédit Agricole. So, these are brands that people felt connected to when they were familiar with them, but there were just not that many who felt all that familiar with them. Now, the opposite of this is these are brands that people felt actually quite familiar with, but really didn't connect to and didn't feel at all a strong degree of connection to. And you see there, two for the big airline brands, Boeing and Airbus. So we'll look a little bit later as to what they're not doing so well, as well as a communication brand like Huawei and financial services like Citigroup. And then a large portion of the brands actually neither connected nor were consumers familiar with. So these were the brands that really, in some ways, did not have any strong relevance to consumers at all in either dimension. So, again, there were those 4 key takeaways we saw: making the impact tangible, bringing consumers into innovation, being cohesive across their audiences, and using simple design. And now we're going to look a little bit about the ones that have done it well per the study and the ones that didn't do it so well per the study. So one brand that was in the highly relevant bucket, IBM, a B2B brand, obviously a brand that at some stage had consumer products, but no longer does and no longer has for a while now. The one thing they do really well is they really made purpose at the core of their brand, and they have communicated that in a way that not only their core audience finds relevant, but also consumers can get. So, they're specific about their industries, and they've also factored in the idea of smarter planet across all of the ways that they talk about all of their businesses. So again, you can see, it's not that the design is the same across all of these, but there is this consistent idea behind it of smarter planet. They also use relevant case studies to show what they do and how they advance not just industries, but what that impact is on humanity and on everyday people. Finally, when they do directly interact with consumers, when what they have is something that consumers experience, they do it in a way that's not just saying, well, we're IBM, we exist. They're actually showing what IBM does in a way that a consumer can relate to, whether that's using their analytics in sports-related settings, or doing something like the Think exhibit, which is showing again how this idea of smarter planet and what they do as a business is impacting humanity as a whole in a way that people want to experience, or even down to how they feature Watson on Jeopardy. So they find ways of actually finding exposure for their brand to consumers, not just in a way to create awareness, but also in a way to create relevance. Now, Cisco is another interesting brand that did well, and again, connects well on a human level, because they, even though they're in some ways this invisible network, if you will, behind all of communications that don't have a real consumer interface, they've found a way of explaining what they do and showing what they do in a way that consumers find relevant. And this has been a focus of theirs in the things they did around CES in 2014, the communications this year. They actually stated that one of their key goals was to make sure that they were going to be relevant to consumers and would connect with them. The way they do this is by having lofty, inspiring messages, things that people can actually buy into in terms of the impact they can have on humanity, and talking about the Internet of Everything, and how really they are the ones that are behind lots of the experiences that people have from a technology standpoint, but also contextualizing it in a way, not just staying at that high level, also providing communications that actually make it tangible and enable people to understand how what Cisco does is actually delivering something meaningful and different to them from a technology standpoint, whether it's the connected home or the connected car, or what they do from a security standpoint. And another thing that they do interestingly compared to other B2B brands is they also engage on quite a few channels, including social. Again, being a strategic branding and design company, we're not endorsing the idea of having cats and dogs in your Facebook or Twitter feed, but it's interesting that they actually don't just focus on communicating in a way that seems very dry and business-like, but do it in a way that really is going to be appealing to a broader audience, including consumers. So now let's look at the opposite end. Same type of company, Huawei, who was familiar to consumers, but that they didn't feel at all connected to. Now, let's sort of see what they have been doing and why maybe that's not as effective as IBM or Cisco, for example. So, they've actually embarked on communications direct to consumers, trying to connect with them and explain, or at least show sort of what Huawei is. However, the messages really don't clarify that. They're very general, high level, and generic. For example, as you see in the middle picture here, they talk about the amount of data that's generated in one day, but don't actually even link it to, well, what does Huawei do in order to help that, and why is that relevant to Huawei or to consumers to even know about this? So it's in some ways attempting what Cisco or IBM have done, but not succeeding at it. Other brands that were in that same quadrant of known, but actually not managing to succeed in connecting and really being relevant, is Boeing and Airbus. And they're interesting brands when you think about actually going back to telecom and communications as a sort of the flip of that, where you think that consumers actually relate a lot to their devices, like that Apple and Samsung and people like that are making, but typically negative about the providers, meaning people like AT&T and Verizon in America, or others like Orange in Europe. In this case, with the airline industry, it's sort of the reverse, where people connect, more or less well, because some airlines don't do it that well, but they have their relationship actually much more strongly with the airline than they do with the device, if you will, the airplane that they're flying on. But part of the reason for this is a lot of Boeing and Airbus's marketing is obviously very much customer focused, not really trying to contextualize what they're providing and doing in a way that a broader audience would understand. And it also leads to the fact that when they do see communications, or when they do hear about the planes and the brands, they're typically associated with problems or failures or crashes, unfortunately. And then when we look at the messages that they put out there, otherwise, they're also often relatively generic and not actually clarifying, well, what's the connection? If Boeing here is obviously doing some communications around, being more linked to America and linked to the military, they're not making it really tangible as to, well, what does this mean and how are they contributing and why is this relevant to me as a consumer? And Airbus actually has an even further challenge, where most of their communications are actually more about Boeing and competing with Boeing rather than even talking about themselves and what they provide. So what that means, and this is looking at just doing some searches around what people talk about when they talk about each of the airlines in media and social media, they're basically talking about each other, and that's all you have. There are very few, if to say no, emotional connections or terms mentioned at all. So now let's look at the second insight, which was seeing that the brands that connect well also do have more of a focus on innovation and encourage innovation and think about consumers when they innovate. And 3M is a really interesting case for that. So 3M obviously for a long time now known as a company that's synonymous with innovation, and also one that's actually extended some of its business innovations into then becoming consumer products, such as the Post-it note even, for example. One of the ways they do this is by bringing consumers into their innovation, not trying to have that be separate, and really factoring consumers right from the start into their innovation process. So they have these innovation centers of technical excellence in over 30 countries, and they bring consumers into these to help them innovate on their products, whether they be ultimately consumer products or things that are actually going to help within a business context. Google, the sort of top brand in terms of being highly relevant and connected to consumers. The interesting thing that they really do is that they're very cohesive and coherent. So even though they have expanded the amount of businesses they're in and the amount of things they do, you still have as a landing page this very simple search bar. You're not even aware if you're on the Google homepage, if you will, of all the other things. You have to go dig down at that bottom bar. So they've managed to really keep that focus on simplicity and on the core, despite growing into more and more businesses. The other thing they've done is in the way they talk about anything they offer to enterprises, it is all about it being not disconnected from how people live and from everyday lives and everyday consumers. The line is work the way you live, and they really see this as a seamless process. So they're not trying to treat their B2B audience in some sort of way that's different from the way they think about their consumer audience. Other, in some ways, famous case study of a B2B brand that's made itself relevant to consumers, in some ways on the back of some of the other consumer technology brands that it's partnered with. I guess I have many clients who've wanted to power something just because of what they've seen Intel has accomplished by being powered by Intel. But really the way they've done this is, again, by connecting with consumers, connecting what they're doing to businesses, making their business from a B2B standpoint non-dissociated from their consumer pool and from having actually consumers demand to have Intel products. So Intel Inside, obviously famous campaign and strategy, and they've continued to extend that with Look Inside, again, continuing to make something which is in essence the inside of a machine, something that consumers normally would not have had any knowledge of or paid attention to, into something that they actually understand and feel is relevant to them and that they want. FedEx is a great example of using design as a way to clarify offerings and being very disciplined in the way they manage their brand. The way they've both incorporated acquisitions like Kinko's into the master brand and managed to retain a very simple system, as well as using color as a way to differentiate between their different offerings. They've always managed to keep clarity at the forefront and use design as a way to help people navigate. 3M, again, this is looking at design and outside of how they've approached innovation with their innovation centers. They also have, if you have the chance to go onto their website, a really interesting way that you can explore all of the innovations and technologies they're doing. One, by showing them in a way that's actually relevant to consumer-type applications, like looking at adhesives in terms of what they can enable consumers to do, but then also using this format of the periodic table as a way of navigating, which is both entertaining and also something that feels approachable to the everyday person, even though it's in some ways a complex and chemically related types of information and technology that they're talking about. So, really our key question to all of you, and again, we'd love to get your questions, but is how relevant do you feel to consumers? And based on the findings that we've shared with you, what do you see this meaning to you as brands? And yes, we'd welcome your questions.
Thank you, Brian. So I'm just looking here through the stream. I also took a look at the Twitter stream, and we have a number of questions. Please feel free to tweet us using hashtag B2BNow, and as well as add the questions to the stream here. The first question I have is for you, Brian. You've been doing this research for quite a while, and you've been working with B2B clients for many years. What surprised you most when you saw the findings from this very comprehensive 9,000 and more respondent study?
Well, I think, to me the surprise is just how few are doing it well. I mean, once you look at the brands, it makes sense. But I think that was really the surprise, was to how select the club really is of especially of the pure B2B brands that actually connect well, the IBMs and the Intels and the Ciscos. So I think that was the biggest surprise to me. It's just how few do it well.
Over the last number of weeks since we launched this study, we've been talking to a number of B2B marketers, clients, non-clients, friends and interested parties. It's a provocative study in many ways. What's the biggest misconception around the analysis and these findings from this study, if any?
I don't know about, and I don't know if I'd qualify this as misconception, but I guess the question we seem to be often getting is just like, well, I do not have the massive advertising budget to do a huge advertising campaign to consumers, so really, what can I do, and is that the only thing I can do? What I've been answering to that is that, I mean, obviously, the top brands have done that, but that is not the only way. The first foundation for doing anything is not to just spend a lot of money on a huge campaign. It's really to get the story right and to express things in ways that are simple and clear and that everybody can understand, even if you are in a complex business, just so that you can actually make it relevant. And the benefit of that is not just making it relevant to consumers, we found, is I think what we found with brands that do that well, they also make themselves more relevant to their own employees, because they make their employees have an easier time explaining what they do, who they work for, what the impact of that is, and in some ways even be prouder of their work because they can contextualize it more to their friends and family. So that's really the first thing. It's not about doing a huge advertising campaign. It's really first just about thinking, how can I really explain what our purpose is, why we exist in a way that anybody can understand? And then secondly, in terms of once that's done, getting that message out there, I think there's a lot of, everybody's talking about in marketing all the time, the fact that big advertising or sort of expensive, huge advertising campaigns are not the way to go anyway, because that's not the way to cut through, and people don't notice that as much any longer. And it's all about finding newer, more nimble and more personalized ways of interacting with people. So I think for that, it's the challenge of any marketing person for any brand, whether it's B2B or B2C, is just finding new ways of cutting through the clutter and getting that message out there in a way that actually resonates.
So if I would paraphrase your response, Brian, you're saying this notion of having a clear and fresh purpose transcends advertising budget. You must be clear on what you're saying in a way that connects to everyday people, and then find clever, creative ways of getting through the clutter, which is the perennial challenge of marketing.
Correct, yes. I mean, obviously a huge advertising budget can never hurt.
Of course,
so if you have that, you should leverage that. But yes.
And speaking of advertising or media coverage, a question coming in from the stream here is, we saw this morning the announcement around Apple IBM.
Right.
In the context of this study, what's your interpretation of that?
Well, I mean, I think that's actually really noteworthy partnership in the sense that it shows two things. One, it shows the fact that Apple understands the huge opportunity that they still have within the enterprise space that they have not captured. There was another data point on that recently that basically executives are the ones who are having iPads, and it hasn't really sort of sunk below into the broader workforce. So I think Apple realizes that, and I think also the opportunity for IBM and where this partnership is potentially really dangerous to all the other enterprise technology players is they're going to have all of the people who develop on Apple and are familiar with iTunes and wanting to basically do things with Apple devices, and who are now going to be interested, or at least find new ways of doing things for enterprises, things that they probably hadn't thought about yet. So it's bringing a whole audience or population of developers to start doing things that they hadn't probably focused on doing before. So yeah, I mean, I thought it was a really interesting and something to really watch in terms of what they do.
And it's fascinating too, because on some dimension it parlays your example around giving consumers a chance to touch the underlying technology and identify applications that perhaps even the product development team never conceived of.
Right.
Like your 3M example in the study.
Yeah, and I think it's also two, if you think about the brands, IBM and Apple, I mean, two really good brands that have obviously done, communicated and been managed in exemplary ways. And I think that's also what that partnership brings, is I don't think anyone, when they had that announcement, wasn't clear, even as an everyday consumer, as to, oh, I understand the value IBM can bring to this, and I understand the value Apple can bring to this, and I can imagine what they can do together. If it had been other brands, even somebody like Samsung and others, it might not have been quite so clear and such a sort of groundbreaking type of announcement.
So one to watch for sure. Another question coming in, and it's a longer question than this conversation will allow us to address, but at a high level, can you speak to the idea of how does a company, for example Boeing, make itself more relevant to consumers when the average consumer may not be very interested in aeronautics or engineering?
Yes, no, I mean, and that's obviously not just a fair question, but one. The thing that's interesting about Boeing and Airbus is consumers are on those planes all the time. They're actually seeing information about those planes all the time, every time they see a safety card. The purpose is not to tell them about aeronautics, but again, back to when we think about how excited people were a century ago about the idea of flight, and now actually people see it as a hassle. It's quite amazing, and that's what has happened in so many industries that you would think were actually revolutionizing how easy and great people's lives could be, which is the same for car rental or for credit cards, for example. Yeah, they're industries that people despise or anyway have typically negative views and negative experiences with. So I think what Boeing and Airbus can do is not to start trying to educate people about the finer details of aeronautics. It really is more about getting people to reconnect with, if you will, the magic of flight to some degree. And in that, they also become better partners with their clients, the airlines, and even though also a lot of their clients are governments and military. But that's really a way that they're adding value to their own B2B clients by connecting with consumers in that way, because that makes consumers also hopefully start looking at airlines in a less cynical fashion, as long as the airlines themselves deliver better experiences.
It's an interesting point, Brian. In an adjacent category, we see the work GE has been doing in the past couple of years to bring some of the most esoteric capabilities like engineering and others to life. And one of the ways they've done this very effectively is through being the first users of many social media platforms, whether it's the 6-second work they're doing with Vine, or whether it's their use of creating apps to really engage people around the mechanics of their offerings. I would submit that the limitation is not the inherent capability, whether it's an Airbus, a Boeing plane, or a submarine, or any underlying technology. The constraint is the imagination of the marketing department to find ways to make it engaging to consumers. What we're bringing to the conversation here is some perspective on the merits of having that consumer at the table when you're thinking about your branding and your communication strategy.
Right. And also end of thinking, even if you are still marketing to your core B2B audience target, of thinking beyond them when you're crafting your communications as well as your strategies and tactics, to just think how much, not that you want to not address them and address consumers instead, but how could you actually do things that can get beyond them and start, if you will, spreading further?
I think we have to ask ourselves the question, as a questioner is posing on the stream, is there a sense of fatigue amongst B2B buyers in our experience concerning these often very aspirational statements that companies are making, whether it's saving the world or saving the planet or humanity, or is there more demand for it? Where do you come out on that equation?
Well, I mean, no, I do. I think it is I think there's a fine line because I do think a lot of people have started doing. I mean, that's why we wanted to show and contrast, if you will, what IBM and Cisco did versus what Huawei is doing. Because I do think that it's practically become a bit of a knee-jerk strategy to just say, okay, let's put a lofty sort of purpose-like message out there. I even think GE actually a little while back practically suffered from doing it too much, and that's not because it's wrong and that there's fatigue on the lofty message, but it's that you have to do per Cisco, you have to do both. You can do the lofty message, but you also have to tie it back tangibly to what you actually really are doing to deliver on that, and to exemplify how the lofty message is actually connected specifically to the types of things that you deliver and do and sell. And I think that's where the lofty message goes wrong, is if it's the lofty message without the tangible connection, yes, then it's just a disconnection. It's
got to be tangible, and I would add authentic
to
that brand.
True.
Yes. A question on the stream is an interesting one, which draws the distinction between professional services companies as B2B providers and enterprises that have a physical product offering. Have we any insights from this study or your more general work, Brian, on the applicability of connecting with consumers in those two business models? Are there meaningful differences depending on whether you're selling services to buyers or selling physical, tangible product?
Yeah, I think, I mean, that's a hard question, or at least one I don't have a ready-made answer for.
Yeah.
What I would think, when we think about sort of tangible, I mean, it can be anything from turbines to selling things that are, like widgets and other things. So it's not that selling something tangible makes it easier because a service is somehow sort of more intangible. I mean, I think it's just lining up the message, if you will, and back to the idea of the purpose and the impact. If you're providing a service, then you have to be able to explain what that ultimate real benefit to people and why you have this service and what it does, not just for the core clients, but really for the world at large. And in the end, it's the same thing if you're selling widgets, if you will. You have to then contextualize what those widgets can do. It's not just about what the widget is and where it goes and what its specs are. It's really about what's the benefit of this widget existing and how it can not just impact the direct buyer's business, but also how it actually then, through that, has a greater impact on people at large.
Yeah, my experience bears out that as well. And what I would say is, if you look at the number of companies and the ranging business models, the trend is increasingly to add services on top of product, augmenting the offering. So increasingly, B2B enterprises all have professional services. Some have a higher proportion that is physical shippable product, but increasingly we're moving to an economy where much of the offerings are service-based, whether the pricing is retainer or a premium or other business models. But that challenge of explaining a service versus a product skews towards the service, and I suppose the dichotomy is less meaningful than ever before as product-based companies add services to their offerings.
True, you could even think, going back to IBM. IBM is the standard example of a company that was a, if you will, product company that then became a service company.
Exactly.
I think if you look at what they've done and done well, they realized that brand was an extremely important factor in being able to make that transition, and that what they did from a brand and communication standpoint was key to them evolving the company successfully from being product to service. I don't think there's a sort of opposite there. I think it's really just about how do you best leverage brand depending on what you have.
Another question from the Twitter stream, an important one. Are there examples of smaller B2B brands without perhaps those deep pockets that in our view have successfully captured consumers and clients, have taken notice as well?
Smaller B2B brands. Sorry, I'm trying to think.
Yeah.
Again, I don't have a ready-made answer here, but I mean, what I would say is, a lot of the emerging technology players, obviously, typically are smaller, and some are B2B, some are B2C. I don't know how well, frankly, any of them have done a truly engaging with consumers. I mean, the one thing I would say is a company like Salesforce that I don't think yet actually connects all that broadly, but the one thing that they are doing, at least that they're bringing into the B2B world, is they're bringing the understanding that the way people want to interface and interact with technology from a consumer standpoint is the same as the way they want to do it from a B2B standpoint, and that you can't sort of excuse, if you will, poor experiences or interfaces and ways of interacting because it's a business solution versus it's a consumer solution. So, I mean, I don't know if I would actually give them the credit of saying that they're connecting that well, and also I don't know that they're that small really any longer because they're obviously growing. But I do think that a lot of the emerging technology B2B players are bringing in a consumer understanding and sort of porting consumer insights into how people want to see and interact with technology into what they're developing in a business space.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the jury's out in terms of the ultimate success, but a number of the emerging technology players assume a very different posture, both in terms of particularly in tech, the user experience to begin with. They leverage how consumers interact with and their knowledge of that behavior when designing the experience from the get-go. And it's not just about their communications. It's the full product usability experience as well.
Correct, right. It's integrating. I mean, I think the challenge lots of those brands face, I mean, or at least from what I've seen, is that typically they are sort of in some ways much more entrepreneurial and free and easy as they mature and grow and potentially merge and acquire each other and things like that. They could encounter issues because typically they are actually much more product focused than they are ultimately still, I think, brand focused. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I look at the storage companies, I look at the companies that, like Hightail and others, that let us share our information online and have both a B2B and B2C. What's interesting, and you touched on it earlier in your Apple discussion, is how a number of companies who start in the B2C realm ostensibly cut their teeth there in delivering communications that matter and port that and the technology into the B2B world. Bring your own device to work in Apple is just a great example of that. But there are many smaller in the app world and other players who first get traction with consumers, and consumers bring those offerings to work, and suddenly they have an enterprise business model. A question's coming up that we may have addressed in part, but I want to address it thoroughly, is the notion of when you're, if you will, an ingredient brand, or how do you connect with consumers when you are, for instance, a service provider on the background, and people might not even know, like an Amadeus, that what you do. Instant awareness, the questioner poses, the first step to relevance. How do you achieve the first one when you aren't a pure B2B brand and you don't have a physical product? I call that sort of an ingredient brand or a capability plumbing behind the scenes. Right. How do you and should you?
Right. Well, yeah, I mean, obviously Intel is the key example of that now. Everybody would love to do Intel again. I mean, in the sense of everybody would like to be Intel in terms of what they've achieved from being that ingredient brand. However, the way they did it, it's hard to believe that any of the, if you will, host brands to that ingredient would agree to get themselves in some ways depositioned by the ingredient, because that's the issue with the ingredient brand in a certain way, that the brand that it is powering, if you will, could end up being cannibalized if it lets itself, if it lets the ingredient brand get built, and that's what HP and Dell in some ways I think realized belatedly with what happened with Intel. But Intel shows though that it's obviously possible that would be the aspiration, is for people to be thinking of you as the power behind what they experience and what they know, and that's in some ways the sort of definition of ingredient. In terms of ways to do that, I think again it's showing that if you have created relevance with the, if you will, end user, with the people that you're actually ultimately trying to reach, even before you've tried to talk to your partners that you're trying to become an ingredient to, that will make the partners or your clients much more likely to want to leverage your brand as an ingredient and to want to co-promote it with you, because they will see the advantage to themselves. So I think that's really the key takeaway, is how do you then leverage either, and if you're a service brand, I mean, how do you leverage the fact that you have insight into the end audience of your business clients in order to add value to them and for them to see value in you? I mean, we've seen this actually just recently looking at a financial services company that whose main audience is financial advisors and not the end investor. However, having insight into the end investor can make them more relevant to the financial advisor, because they help the financial advisor with their clients. Yeah. So I think that's what every ingredient brand can do, is basically if you can help your B2B clients with their end customer, you'll become more relevant, and then they'll be more likely to help build your brand for you.
That's very interesting. I'm glad you brought up the financial services example. I think the modern day equivalent to some extent of the evolution of the ingredient brand is towards platforms, and the notion that, if well executed, I'm speaking now to the why of establishing strong connection on the platform, it allows you to scale the application of the technology into so many other ways. So developing a strong platform brand is a big part of the rationale to doing so. It's inherent in a growth strategy for a lot of these companies.
Yeah, that's if it's technology. Yeah, that's if you have a technology platform. Yeah.
True, and even in the financial services, insights can inform the creation of many product offerings, of course, as well. So there are corollaries across B2B
Correct,
sectors.
exactly, right. You can then, by better understanding your customers and audience, you can then develop better products and services to sell to your customers so that they can resell them, if you will.
Now, the question that always comes up, and we want to spend a moment on, has come up this morning as well, and that is one of measurement. Brian, how, in your view, should B2B companies measure the success of their consumer-centric marketing, especially when they have been very focused on bottom-line ROI?
Well, that's really why we did the study, was to see what that business benefit could be, if you will, and that's, so what we saw was this increase in consideration, as well as, obviously looking at the financial metrics and seeing that they were better for the ones that connect well and than the ones that didn't. But what we saw, back to how people should measure their efforts, I do think there's two key dimensions, but what we looked at, it's not just reach and familiarity, meaning it's not just awareness generation. And that, in many ways in the past, I think lots of B2B brands that have made efforts within the consumer space, just because they were big brands and big businesses, have done it really purely with awareness generation as opposed to any type of true relevancy or connection, such as doing sports endorsements being one of the big examples, or doing advertising in large venues that people can see, but not in a way that potentially everybody then contextualizes what they see. So awareness is not the only metric, but it's one, awareness and familiarity. The other one is how well are you actually making yourself relevant? How well are you connecting? And back to those attributes that I shared earlier, those are the ones that we saw were most indicative of doing that, which is communicating clearly, showing that you understand consumers' needs and are focused on them, and that you're trustworthy and reliable.
So as we come to the last 10 minutes in the discussion, Brian, let's give our listeners something very practical that they can do tomorrow morning, if you will, to assess how do they know if indeed they are connecting with consumers. Are there questions they should consider asking of themselves?
Yes, and we have that. If people have, and if you haven't downloaded it, or if you want actually a hard copy, you can ask us. But which we have in the report, on the last or next to last page of the report, we actually outline some of the key questions that marketers and business decision makers should think about when they're evaluating what they're doing and their brands. So I'll just go through those quickly. But the first one is, have you clearly articulated your purpose in a way that everyone can relate to? Related to that, do your friends and family actually even understand what your company does and how it makes a difference? Can employees say why they are proud to work there, and is this something that is clear to them? Do you bring consumers, or let's say if you will, end users of your clients, insights into what you do from an innovation and product development standpoint? Do you even think about engaging consumers as a way to generate demand with your customers? And finally, looking at in a more sort of tactical way at how the brand and communications are executed. Are they consistent? Are they simple? Are they clear? Is your portfolio and your brand architecture simple, easy to navigate, easy to understand, not just to even your business prospects, but to an everyday person? Do you need to know 25 acronyms in order to understand what you're offering, or is it actually possible for someone who is not been in the industry for 20 years to actually understand what you're offering? And then finally, have you thought about design and how to clarify and simplify by design?
So those are very, very many questions. What we would advise our listeners to join us is take a look on our website. At the end of this webcast, we will provide a link to download the report, which has all of the questions, if you will, as a diagnostic that Brian has swiftly gone through this morning. I also tweeted out a link to where you can download the report. You can find that on Twitter at #B2BNow. And I think that wraps up the questions on the Twitter stream as well as the GoToWebinar stream. So I'll end with a couple of remarks. First and foremost, thank you all very much for joining us, for your participation on the webinar, for your thoughtful and very well articulated questions on both the Twitter stream and on this stream. We invite you to connect with us on Twitter at Siegel+Gale. You can also connect with me personally, Margaret Malloy at Siegel+Gale, with any follow-up questions specific to your brand, specific to the study. And I'd be delighted to further that conversation. I've also provided Brian Rafferty's email on this slide. By way of reminder, Siegel+Gale is a brand strategy firm. We are full service. We begin everything we do with rigorous thinking, and that manifests itself in the research and deliverables that Brian and his team delivers, through to designing great customer experiences, helping think through your brand strategy, the visual elements, the content elements and the naming elements of that strategy, and of course, we're very thoughtful about how that strategy is implemented in the consumer's mindset, as well as how it touches your employees through the in-person channel as well as the digital channel. Once again, thank you, Brian.
Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we look forward to your continuing the conversation at #B2BNow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.